Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And when it comes to pure, unrepentant villains, few characters set as high a bar as Lex Luthor. In the same way that Superman is the perfect embodiment of heroism, Lex Luthor perfectly embodies the complete opposite. Whereas Superman stands for truth, justice, and the American way, Lex Luthor stands for himself, his ego, and his way. Now, if you've consumed any amount of Superman media, be they comic books, movies, TV shows, or cartoons, you already know this. Lex Luthor's place in the annals of superhero history is secure, and over the years, he's done plenty to establish just how villainous he can be. From stealing 40 cakes, to becoming president of the United States, to destroying New Krypton, to murdering his own parents for the insurance money, the sheer breadth of Lex Luthor's misdeeds have few equals. But for most of those stories, we've only really seen them unfold from the perspective of Superman. It's been exceedingly rare for us to get a story that's almost entirely from Lex's perspective. Sure, we've had a few insights here and there, most notably in stories like All-Star Superman, but we rarely get a fleshed out story that allows us to see the world of DC Comics as Lex sees it. But that's exactly what we get with Lex Luthor Man of Steel, a 5-issue miniseries from 2005. Written by Brian Azzarello and drawn by Lee Bermejo, this was one of those comics with a bold concept that could either work beautifully or fail miserably. But when all was said and done, the former won out, and it is definitely a worthy addition to my ever-evolving list of Jack's comic gems. Now, if you go into this comic hoping for a story that casts Lex in a more sympathetic light, you're going to be disappointed. Because this comic does not attempt to reimagine or reinvent Lex Luthor in any meaningful way. It doesn't even offer much depth into why he is who he is. More than anything else, Lex Luthor Man of Steel explores Lex's perspective on the world, from how he sees Superman to how he sees humanity, and how this all fits into his overarching goals. In terms of the general plot, we mostly follow Lex as he hatches his latest plan to defeat and discredit Superman. But unlike so many other Superman stories, we don't just see the machinations and the spectacle. We also see the thought process that goes into it. It all surrounds the creation of Hope, a female android endowed with superhuman abilities on par with Superman. But, unlike so many of the other weapons Lex has created, Hope is a lot more personal to him. There's a much more emotional connection to her and what she represents. Pragmatically speaking, she's still a hero like Superman, but she's one that Lex can control. He even presents her to the public as someone who can carry out Superman's duties when he's not available. On paper, it seems like an objective good for the world. But then again, this is Lex Luthor we're talking about here. Just doing good is never his primary agenda. And this is where seeing things from Lex Luthor's perspective really gives greater weight to the story. Because in the process of creating Hope and shaking the perspectives around her, we get a great deal of insight into how Lex sees the world around him and why he sees Superman as such a threat. Because unlike the rest of the adoring public, Lex doesn't just see what Superman does, and he doesn't just listen to Superman's many heroic platitudes. To Lex, Superman is still an alien outsider wielding godlike power that he did nothing to earn. He may look human, he may pretend to be human, he's even embraced by humanity as a whole, and they trust him more than they would trust any other human. On the surface, that may seem good and noble, but Lex Luthor, believing himself to be smarter and more capable than any other human in existence, he dares to look deeper. He sees a being whose very presence reduces humans to ants. It doesn't matter to him that Superman uses his vast powers to help people and save innocent lives. Lex sees that as akin to parents doing their kids' homework and thinking that'll make them smarter. But all it really does in the long run is make them dumber, lazier, and less capable. Now, is that perspective cynical, misguided, and misanthropic? Yes, it is. But is it somewhat understandable to the non-Lex Luthors of the multiverse? Definitely. This context is key in Lex Luthor Man of Steel, because we see how this perspective affects Luthor as he uses Hope against Superman. He has her do many of the same things that Superman does, helping people, staving off disaster, and fighting criminals. And this does earn her widespread public approval. Sure, it's not nearly enough to convince people to reject Superman in favor of Hope, but those results are secondary to Lex. Because what matters more to him is what Hope represents. She is not just a superhero that he can control, although that is certainly part of it. She is very much a byproduct of his genius, a perfect extension of his greatness and his ego. Hope and Superman can do the same heroic deeds, but what Hope does is more meaningful in Lex Luthor's eyes because she is a product of humanity, whereas Superman is an alien who will never be human. It feels oddly metaphorical on some levels, because in a world with Superman, nobody needs Hope. They already have someone else to fill that role. But in a world without Superman, humanity can't rely on some otherworldly savior. They must create hope themselves, literally and figuratively. This is wonderfully reflected in a few tense exchanges between Lex and Superman. Most of that happens at the end of the comic. I won't spoil every detail, I'll just say that Superman doesn't say or do much, but he really doesn't have to. Lex does most of the talking, and what he says goes beyond his hatred for Superman and everything he represents. It also builds directly on what ultimately happens with Hope. That's another major detail that I won't spoil. I'll just note that over the course of the story, there's a unique bond that develops between her and Lex. And yes, that bond does get physical at one point, and yes, that implies exactly what you think it does. But it also gives this elaborate plan a much more personal touch. Being such an egocentric narcissist, Lex takes everything personally. He sees himself as the greatest, most capable human being in existence. Whereas Superman is an affront to that perspective, Hope is its greatest manifestation. But like every other plot or creation from Lex Luthor, she's also a means to an end. And that's also where Lex Luthor's greatest weakness manifests. What happens to Hope, what happens with Superman, and what ultimately plays out with Lex Luthor, it's not overly shocking. Lex Luthor Man of Steel doesn't offer any major twists in that regard. But it doesn't have to. The overall story works because it perfectly reflects Lex's strengths along with his weaknesses. And because of his ego, he will never, ever confront those weaknesses. But through the perspective that Lex Luthor Man of Steel lays out, we better understand the how and why. It may not make Lex more sympathetic, but it helps us better grasp the true depths of his villainy, and ultimately, that just makes him all the more villainous in the grand scheme of things. But don't just take my word for it. Check this comic out for yourself. As always, I'll leave a Comixology Amazon link in the description. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Stay tuned for more of my comic book gems, and please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. So until next time, take care and stay safe.